So the election is over, and Donald John Trump is now the 47th president of the United States. I have to eat some crow because in my previous video, Trump will lose, I predicted that Kamala Harris would take the presidency instead, but it appears that this time there were ethics in video game journalism, as Argent likes to say, and everything went according to plan. The GOP strategy of attempting to appeal to a broader base of voters actually did work, and we saw minority counties flip from being historically Democrat to Republican, some counties for the first time since the 1800s. Now, of course, a lot of conservatives are going to celebrate this as a great victory of conservative ideology. They're going to say that the broader American people, regardless of creed, race, or color, have decided to jettison the Democratic ideology because it's simply too radical. People are tired of the wokeness. The generally culturally conservative Hispanics have rejected the gay rights and LGBT agenda, as they say. But for the broader right, I think this is ultimately actually a worrying sign, because it means the GOP can now pivot away from being implicitly pro-white and generally speaking a party of the white man to a party of Hispanics. And this means that white-leaning policies like demographic controls and immigration controls will remain secondary on the ballot, and economic concerns will take priority. The GOP has shown that it's not willing to avert demographic collapse, but instead willing to adapt to it. So the chance of the broader right trying to take control of the GOP and lead it into a more radical direction are basically approaching zero now. So the victory of Trump puts dissidents in a worse position than if Kamala had won. Because if Kamala had won, then we could at least tell the GOP or say to the GOP, if you keep ignoring white interests, you're going to never win an election again. But we don't have this kind of leverage anymore. And instead, they're essentially deciding that appealing to minorities is a viable strategy. Appealing to Jamal and Enrique is now the GOP mainline strategy, and it will be in the future. And essentially, they don't need white people anymore. And since white people are unwilling to summon up any kind of collective racial interest, they have also decided that they don't want any leverage against the GOP either. They have no basis on which to say, you're not acting in our interests, so we won't vote for you. Instead, they've essentially been completely captured under the false idea that it's somehow beneficial to us to vote GOP. As for the specific policies that Trump will enact, he campaigned to some extent on immigration, although not as hard as he did in 2016. He's completely dropped talk of building the wall. He hasn't mentioned a single iota this election. And of course, people are questioning whether he even will. Trump has been promising for 8 years now to end birthright citizenship, and people are saying that's the first thing he's going to do when he's in office. But he hasn't done it during the 4 years he was president. And during the next 4 years, it was essentially just empty bluster. And then there's the subject of legal immigration, which Trump has been historically weak on. During his presidency, there was a massive explosion in H-1B visas, and we have every reason to expect that during his second term in office, he's going to expand H-1B visas even more. His vice president, J.D. Vance, has an Indian wife, and Indians, of course, are notorious for being massive H-1B visa recipients, especially in the tech industry. So we have every reason to believe that during this Trump presidency, we're going to see an H-1B visa expansion rather than the reduction that we very severely need, because the biggest threat to demographic stability isn't illegal immigration, it's actually legal immigration. And since legal immigration vastly affects the professional sector, it lowers wages the worst out of all forms of immigration. Then there's the question of Zionism and Israel and Palestine. And Trump is, of course, not going to be right-wing on this position. He's going to be a Zionist. We all knew this going in, and everyone knows he's not going to stop being a Zionist in the second term, right? And there's more proof of this in the fact that he still has Jared Kushner handpicking his cabinet, and he's basically the head of Trump's transition team. And there's another Jim in his transition team who is, of course, going to appoint pro-Israel people to his cabinet. And I've even heard rumors that this Jim is forcing every one of his presumptive cabinet picks to pass an Israel loyalty. Of all certainties in the Trump administration, we can be absolutely sure that we will send even more money to Israel than ever before as the conflict continues to get more critical. And of course, there is everyone's fear, which is that we're going to war with Iran. Israel has recently engaged in escalatory attacks against Iran. They've bombed things in Iranian territory. So things are just heating up at the moment. And since Trump is such a hardcore Zionist, we can be almost sure that he is going to approve of implicitly, if not explicitly, these attacks on Iran and possibly even get the United States involved. As for economics, we can expect essentially the same typical GOP policies, cutting taxes and giving breaks to big corporations, and in general, deregulating and emphasizing the capitalist free market. We're not going to get a populist position on economics. People are hopeful for this during the first term. Trump kind of talked like he was going to do single payer health care, and he was going to do certain things for the forgotten man or the working class white man in the Rust Belt. But none of this ever materialized. And instead, we just got tariffs, we got tax cuts, we got typical GOP shenanigans. Generally nothing that addresses wealth disparities or helps out the white working class in any meaningful way. These big corporations still have free reign to conduct their woke social experiments and to essentially keep their stranglehold on culture completely secure. He hasn't whatsoever talked about going after them or competing in the culture war in any meaningful way. Then, of course, there's all this talk about Project 2025, and people are debating whether Trump will implement anything from the huge document that outlined essentially a libertarian deregulation plan to get the federal government. And that's essentially what it is. I know on the left, they're hyperbolically talking about how it's going to make the Handmaid's Tale real. There's going to be like Handmaid's Tale squads going out and like capturing women, and women are going to be slaves to white men. And they're going to put transgender people in camps, all this hyperbolic fear mongering on the left. Of course, it's the very thing they accuse conservatives of doing, fear mongering against an invisible enemy, but they do it harder than anyone else. And of course, the leftists wanted to put people in camps during 2020, but they don't talk about that. It's the right wing who are fascists. The left wing would never do anything authoritarian. But the big question is whether Project 2025 is legitimate and whether Trump will implement anything from it. I've heard rumors that Trump has met from people of Project 2025 during his, as he's setting up his transition team. But those are just rumors. Trump has repeatedly, during his talks, disavowed Project 2025. And it has reached such a point of disrepute where the leader of Project 2025 had to step down. And then there's the question whether anything from Project 2025 is really even all that right wing. Now, it's definitely very socially conservative. They're talking about going after like gender affirmative care and transgender medicine and stuff like that. And they're talking about going after like LGBT education in schools, which is very positive. But that's essentially it. The rest of it's just libertarian deregulation, which doesn't help us in the slightest, considering one of our biggest cultural enemies, in the culture war are these huge corporations. And if anything, freeing the free market to dominate us even further rather than allowing the state to dominate the free market is counterproductive. As always, the biggest problem with the GOP is that it insists that the free market is a right-wing idea, even though throughout history, right-wing governments, which, we could say they're retroactively right-wing, even though left and right didn't have any meaning if you go that far back in history. But right-wing governments in history have always regulated the market in some way, whether that's by requiring guilds to be chartered before they can do business, or having a hierarchical thing set up where you have to be a member of a guild to do business, and you can only trade to certain people. You can't trade to peasants. You have to trade in cities, etc., which in general kept the market from proletarianizing and ensured that some kind of elite hierarchy could stay in place that actually preserved culture rather than destroying it. So the GOP free market policy of giving companies unfettered reign to essentially dominate culture and dominate society is not beneficial to us whatsoever. So this is why I'm very unoptimistic regarding the Trump presidency. I think in every single way, it's just going to be a classical GOP presidency. We're going to get free market policies. We're going to get some token attempts to address the culture war, some token attempts to make the United States more culturally conservative, but it's not going to be enough. It's not going to address the reasons why our culture has run away into degeneracy in the first place. Conservatives, of course, are obsessed with fairness, and they're obsessed with democracy and liberalism. So they're not going to take this opportunity to shore up their power in any way. Now, Trump might get some Supreme Court picks, which would be very beneficial. But as for the rest of the government, they're not going to, I doubt they're going to completely gut the thing and install conservatives everywhere and make it very difficult for the left to regain a foothold in education, the FDA, and other government organizations. I think once again, they're going to play fair with their mortal enemies, and they're going to just keep the status quo moving along. Because what we have in the United States is essentially a uniparty as controlled by gym donors. And if you think about this as two ideologically opposed factions fighting each other, you're not really going to understand what's happening, because the reality is it's just two neoliberal ideologies playing off each other to create the illusion of conflict and difference. And as long as people are locked into these fake ideological struggles between two factions that seem ideologically opposed, but in reality are very close to each other, things aren't really going to be very productive. We need politics that breaks out of this leftoid, rightoid dichotomy, this Democrat-Republican dichotomy, and instead focuses on sincere principles. And the more hope that people put into the GOP to enact radical right-wing policies, the more they'll just be disappointed, because it is in the end just a Zionist neoliberal party. You get what it says on the tin. You don't get anything more. You don't get anything less. It's the same every single election cycle. And people still, they're writing these hyperbolic, these absurdly hyperbolic fan fictions about Trump, about how he'll put libtards in camps and he'll ensure right-wing dominance for the next century. And this is like a momentous, groundbreaking, era-defining moment for the United States. Look, I'm going to tell you it's none of that. And if you think that, you're going to be extremely disappointed, because we're just getting another free market GOP presidency. A lot of you guys are putting way too much stock into how liberals view the Trump victory. And of course, they're very hyperbolic. They think they're going in camps. They think they're going to be literally killed. They think Trump is Orange Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. If you actually believe this and you look at this from the leftist perspective, you're going to get such a delusional picture of what's actually happening, because they're not right about any of this. Even the communists on Reddit are less delusional than a lot of rightoids, because they're correctly pointing out that the GOP and the Democratic Party are just liberal parties. They're just capitalist parties. And in fact, they've been complaining that the reason Kamala Harris lost is because she was too right-wing. Right-wing meaning free market in this context. And to be honest, they're probably not wrong. If leftist candidates were more radical on economics, they might actually start winning more victories, because there are a lot of dispossessed and displaced people economically in the US, particularly working class people. And if they could reach out to working class white people sufficiently with a radical economic policy, it might actually work. But the thing is, both of these parties are extremely liberal. This is why elections are so close, because there's barely a difference between the parties. It's why such a thing as a swing state exists, because there are people who are sort of centrist, because there aren't differences between the parties. So of course they can afford to be centrist and just say, well, this election I'm voting blue, that election I'm voting red, because there are no principles at play here. There are no sine qua nons. But of course, the Trump victory will definitely be fun. I'll give it that much. There's already been a lot of hilarious raging and meltdowns on the left. You can, of course, just Google that. There's one on the iHypocrite channel. I think Matt Walsh has a compilation. There's a lot of good content out right now. If you go on Reddit, a lot of people are crying and complaining and claiming they're going to leave the United States and bug out to Canada. I think Hassan Piker said he's moving to Japan. So that's definitely brilliant, and I'm happy this is happening. But Trump derangement syndrome is, of course, not new, and we knew this was coming. And, all I can say to these people is you need to grow up and calm down, because this is just going to be another liberal presidency. You're used to living under liberalism. It's not going to change. You're not going into camps. There's just going to be fewer taxes on corporations and a few corporate breaks. That's it. It's the same thing that's been happening for the past 100 years. It's not changing. It's not getting better. It's not getting worse. It's just the status quo. Calm down. But I guess as rightists, we can take this opportunity to gloat a little bit and have a little bit of fun and just sit back and relax. And, maybe things will turn out for the better. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised, and Trump, because he's not seeking re-election, will be able to double down on making the US a conservative place and a very right-wing place. but I have my doubts. I don't think this is going to happen. Everything I said in my previous video is true about Trump. He's an opportunist. He's very non-ideological, and he essentially just does what people tell him to do. So I don't think he has some kind of master plan behind this presidency. I don't think this QAnon conspiratard shit is true. He's not going to drain the swamp. He didn't do it in his first term. He won't do it in the second term. Everyone he appoints will refuse to listen to him. And to all those delusional people who think that Trump is going to stage a coup, the military didn't listen to him in the first presidency. They're not going to listen to him in this one. To stage a coup, the president needs the power of command. And the military is so sufficiently politicized that they've essentially stopped listening totally to the commander in chief. So you're not going to get a coup, even if Trump did want to pose one, which, you know, I have zero confidence that he would ever do something like that. But in general, if you're at all whatsoever literate about the various, you know, right-wing intellectual fixations, of course, you know the ones I'm talking about, you'll understand that this is nothing but this isn't even a blip in history. It doesn't change any of the general historical trends that have put the right on the back foot and led to the ascendancy of progressive politics. All of the intellectual revolutions that have been carried out in universities and in think tanks and in the government, they're going to continue. Trump isn't going to put a stop to that. He's not going to put a stop to postmodernism. He's not going to put a stop to critical theory. He's not going to put a wrench into the spanner of the left-wing intellectual engine. And I think really, if you want to dominate culture, you need to take the intellectual reins in society. Otherwise, we're just giving up. And Trump won't do this. He doesn't have the power to do it. He doesn't have the willingness or the intelligence to do it. We're essentially just going to keep losing. And I don't think a Trump victory is going to be the sort of final boss that everyone thinks it is. It's not going to change politics for the next 100 years. It won't even change it for the next like 10 years. You know, it's going to be 4 years of conservative free market ideology, and then it'll be almost as if it never happened. So if you take one thing away from this, let it be that you shouldn't get your hopes up too much during elections. And in fact, I don't think you should invest yourself in elections at all, because it's just a show. It's just theater. You know, the real ideology that runs the show is independent of party and person. And it's just going to keep continuing like this. Things are just going to keep going downhill until there is a radical upset in the power balance of the United States. It would take the oligarchy completely ending and democracy being upset to actually lead to any kind of positive change. And one final thing I want to address is, of course, the war in Ukraine. People are saying Trump will end the war in Ukraine, but I don't personally see a concrete way Trump could actually achieve that, because NATO and European countries are absolutely committed to finishing this war. They want to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and various other people into this bloodbath. They've shown no signs of ever wanting to stop. The only way Trump could make a meaningful impact in the war is to stop sending weapons, but that wouldn't essentially be a peaceful end to the war. It'd essentially just guarantee Russian victory. And this would, of course, restart the Russia conspiracy theory and all that other crap. If Trump wants to hold peace talks, then it will turn out the same way peace talks have turned out in the past couple of years, basically. Mexico tried to call for peace talks, but the terms are basically Russia gets Crimea and Ukraine has to give up its lost territory. And then there's a pause on the conflict. That doesn't satisfy either party, because Putin wants to annex all of Ukraine and Ukraine wants to keep all of its territory. So any peace talks that are held will essentially unfold in the exact same way, with neither party being satisfied and essentially saying no to the terms of the peace deal. I fully expect the war in Ukraine to come to whatever conclusion is foregone for it. I suspect Russia will win because they're the only ones that are regularly making territorial gains there. And I think they have a much better economic stranglehold there. Like, I think they have more arms, they have more people, they have more manpower. I think they're ultimately going to win the war of attrition, but we'll see. I don't think Trump is going to make a difference in this whatsoever. I'm sorry if this is a little dour, a little black-pilled, but I'm just speaking the truth as it is. I don't want people to get caught up in these political fantasies about how they're going to totally win because we won an election. This happens regularly, even in European countries, where some populist gets elected and then decides to betray his own base. This is going to happen perennially, because these politicians are controlled by outside actors. They're not actually acting in our interests. They don't care about us. They just use us to get elected. That's the reality of the situation. And if you don't like that, well, I don't like it either, but it's best not to tell ourselves fake stories about it in order to cope.